My girlfriend Sarah and I are avid campers. In particular, we love backcountry camping. This generally entails hiking 10 or 15 miles out into the woods, and then setting up camp and hanging out there for a few days. We've camped at campgrounds before, and while the amenities are nice, it just doesn't cut it. Sleeping out in the wilderness, miles away from civilization, is pure magic. Now, I'll be the first one to tell you that backcountry camping is not for everyone. It can be extremely dangerous. Usually, you even need a permit to even do it. Sarah and I have years of experience under our belts, otherwise we wouldn't even consider it. For this particular trip, we decided to meet up with another couple, Matthew and Divya. They're several years older than us, in their 30s, and he works for a tech company and she's a freelance photographer. They don't have children, but they have a big German Shepherd mix named Max, who they had brought with us. The four of us arrived at Pine Lake Park at 6 a.m. Given it was October, the sun was just rising, painting the sky shades of pink and gold. Long shadows stretched across the parking lot, cast by the forest in the fiery throes of autumn. Shade engulfed us as we entered the forest. The leaves fluttered above. A bird chirped somewhere, the shrill whistle echoing through the trees. Our goal was to hike the entire 9 miles today to the scenic overlook at the summit of Mount Kiernan. It was only 1,000 feet up, a glorified hill really, but apparently the view was gorgeous. It would take 4 or 5 hours at our leisurely pace. The trail started out wide and straight, but after a sharp left, it meandered uphill. The terrain wasn't the best, studded with rocks and gnarled roots. Good thing that we were taking it slow. As Sarah and I talked, Divya stopped behind us to take a photo. The sharp click of the camera shutter cut through the forest air. Somehow, I felt a bit unsettled. Matthew was uncharacteristically quiet, hands shoved in his pockets. Divya was taking a lot of photos, more than I would expect. It felt like every 5 minutes. We're never going to make it if she takes this many photos the whole way, I whispered to Sarah while Matthew was busy giving Max a drink. I know, I get that this is like her livelihood, but it's getting kind of annoying. When we continued forward, the trail narrowed and began a steeper ascent. The thick brush crept in on both sides, threatening to take the trail back over, reclaim it as a part of the forest. I found myself checking the trees every so often, making sure that the white trail blaze was still pointing forward, and that we were still on the right path. Everything seemed to be going smoothly until 3 hours in. As we rounded a bend, I saw it, a bright orange sign on the side of the trail. In bold letters, it read, "Warning. If warning siren sounds, immediately leave area. Go uphill 500 steps." Below the text, there was an icon of a man running uphill and a picture of something that looked like a tornado siren tower. "What the hell is this?" Matthew asked. "Maybe it's for flash flooding," Divya said, pulling out her camera. Click. "I didn't think it flooded around here though. Weird." "Yeah, they don't usually mark flood zones on the map," Sarah asked. The four of us stared at it. Even Max seemed confused, staring up at it with his head cocked. It didn't make sense for a few reasons. First, flash flooding wasn't really common in Ohio. I had only ever seen ominous signs warning of flash floods like this when Sarah and I took a vacation out to Death Valley in 2018. Second, at this point, we were about 7 miles from civilization. Would the park really allocate funds to build a siren tower out here? How many people walk this trail annually? 10, maybe 20? It seemed unlikely. I glanced around. From where we were, I couldn't see any sort of siren tower. I pulled on my phone to search for information about it, but we were already too far out to get reception. Of course, for safety, we all had walkie-talkies and personal locator beacons, but those didn't get internet, of course. so there was no way for me to get more information. "Let's just stay alert, I guess," I said, "and if we hear any sirens or water, we'll run uphill." Besides, we would be at the campsite in an hour or two, and that was at the top of the mountain, and we would be safe for the duration of our stay. What were the chances that a flood would hit right now before we had reached the summit? And that brought up an even weirder thought. Wait, if it's about flash flooding, shouldn't the sign be at the bottom of the hill, like by the parking lot? If the area that we were standing in right now was a flooding hazard, certainly the parking lot and the entire white trail beneath us was also a flooding hazard. But the sign was only up here. "Yeah, that's weird," Matthew agreed. "I don't even see any kind of siren system," Sarah said, craning her neck as she looked up and all around. "That's probably at the top of the mountain," I replied. "Oh great, so we're going to be camping next to a siren," Sarah grumbled. We continued the hike upwards, but the doubt was creeping in. Whenever Sarah and I go backcountry camping, we do quite a lot of research on the area. We read forum posts and reviews and sometimes even reach out to people who've camped there before. We know that preparation can be the difference between life and death out here, and we like to prepare as much as possible. Nothing that we read had said anything about flash flooding. From what we had read, Pine Lake Park was even safer than average. The last death here was almost 40 years ago. A local young woman apparently, and not even a hiker. But we continued since we were so close to the campsite anyway. The trail curved steeply upward and I noticed a little stream far below cutting through the woods. The water looked pitch black from up here, gently lapping over the rocks. "Is that the stream that floods?" Sarah asked, following my gaze. "I don't think so," I replied. The stream was really tiny, no more than 4 feet across, and there was still a fair amount of underbrush all around it. If this area flooded often, there wouldn't be much vegetation, due to the erosion and whatnot. Also, we were much higher than the stream. For the flood to reach the trail that we were on, it would have to be a lot of water. Unless there was a dam around here that I didn't know about. Sometimes dams would open on a timer with a siren to warn anybody nearby. I turned to Matthew and Divya, who knew the area better than we did. "Is there a dam around here?" Matthew and Divya exchanged a glance. "Not that I know of," Matthew said. "'Cause flooding this trail when there's a gully down there doesn't make sense. Unless there's like tons and tons of water," I replied. Maybe the signs for monsoon season," Sarah asked. "There aren't monsoons in Ohio," Matthew said with a chuckle. We continued climbing uphill, but just a few minutes later we encountered another sign. It said the same thing except the elevation had changed. "Warning. If warning siren sounds, immediately leave area. Go uphill 100 steps." "Hey, at least we're getting near the safe zone," Sarah said, redoing her ponytail. Matthew stared at the sign, looking troubled. "I don't like this," I said. "Sarah and I researched this place really thoroughly, and nothing came up about flash flooding." "Hey, what if they weren't put up by the park rangers?" Sarah asked. "What if some rando put them up here? Like there's something really dangerous in 100 steps and they're trying to lure us to it." The three of us stared at her. "I'm just kidding," Sarah said with a grin. "Come on, we're almost there." So the four of us continued. The forest seemed to grow thicker and darker, the air smelled damp and earthy. Matthew and Sarah got into a conversation about some anime TV series, and Divya fiddled with her camera. Max bounded up the trail and I brought up the rear of the group, pausing to take a sip of water. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. In fact, I felt like I was being watched. I always thought that it was weird when people talked about feeling watched. I mean, that's not a scientific thing, is it? How would you know if somebody was watching you? But now, I wondered if maybe I had just never felt it before, Because as I stood there on the narrow trail, several yards behind everyone else, there was this crawling, heavy feeling on my back. I glanced back, but all I saw was more and more forest tangled in on itself. I capped my water bottle and I jogged to catch up, but the feeling did not stop. I felt like there was something out there somewhere watching the four of us. I was yanked out of my thoughts by Divya's shout. "Hey, look at this." Matthew, Sarah, and Divya were clustered around the edge of the trail looking up at something. I hurried over to see a metal structure, the remains of a fire lookout tower from what I could tell. It was clear, however, that it hadn't been used in a very long time. The metal struts and beams were rusted, and one of the windows was shattered, sharp glass jutting out of the frame like teeth. It was an empty shell, a corpse, thick vines climbing up its bones, the forest eager to devour it. "This is so cool," Divya squealed, taking tons of photos, crouching and stretching to get the perfect angles. Even Max seemed excited, skipping around the base of it, stopping here and there to sniff. "Wow, I guess it was decommissioned, huh?" I commented. "Yeah, a lot of the fire towers have been replaced by drones," Matthew replied. "Costs a lot of money to staff these things." "This is like the coolest thing that I've ever seen," Sarah said, pulling out her phone to take a photo as well. "The coolest thing that you've ever seen, really?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. "What about that time that we saw the albino deer?" "Well, other than wildlife, I mean," she said with a smile. And that's when it hit me. During our entire 4-hour hike, we hadn't seen a single animal. I mean, I had heard birds chirping, but we hadn't seen any deer, foxes, or rabbits. I glanced around the forest, at the trees blotting out the light, at the vines climbing the rusted legs of the tower. I took a deep breath of the damp, earthy air. "You're being paranoid." As much as I hated to admit it, Sarah was the braver one in our relationship. Nothing scared her. Even now, 8 miles away from civilization in an eerily quiet forest, she was looking up at the old fire watchtower with a big grin on her face. And then to my absolute horror, she took a step up onto the ladder. "Sarah, no!" I shouted. She shot me a dirty look. "What? You can't climb that." "I wasn't going to, geez. I just wanted to check to see if it was stable." The rusted metal creaked as she stepped back down. She looked up, squinting, and gave the whole thing a good shake. "It seems fine, but I don't want to die today." I stared at her in horror, my heart still pounding. But then I heard Divya calling us around to the other side of the tower. Matthew got there first. He followed her gaze upwards and his jaw went slack. Heart dropping, I ran over. There was a sheet of paper taped to one of the windows that was still intact. 2 words written in frantic, scribbly letters. "Send help." The sign was old, the paper yellowed. The letters were distorted by the cracks, spiderwebbing across the glass. Whoever had wrote it, had help ever arrived, or had it been too late for them? I swallowed, my mouth dry. Nervous energy coursed through my entire body. Maybe it was time to abort the hike, go back home, or maybe see if the campground had any openings. Loud kids and light pollution sounded pretty great compared to this. "Hey, maybe we should head home," I said. "What, because of that?" Sarah asked, gesturing to the tower. "Because of everything, the flash flooding, this, I don't feel safe." "But we're so close." I sighed. "This is how people die camping, Sarah, when they refuse to change plans. When the weather gets bad or they find something weird and they just keep on going. So what, we're going to cancel the trip that we've been planning for months because, what, some sign scared you? For all we know, this is a prank by some local teenagers. Not only that, what if it floods, huh? What if we're trapped on top of the mountain for days because the trail is underwater? And we have the beacons. But she was cut off by a loud, high-pitched sound, piercing the forest. The siren. The four of us froze, staring at each other. "We need to get uphill," Sarah said, stepping decidedly back onto the trail. "Come on." "We're already far enough uphill," I called, stumbling after her, shouting to be heard over the screech of the siren. "The sign said 100 steps, and that was way back there." "Hey, better safe than sorry," she shouted back. I wasn't thrilled about hiking even further away from our car, civilization, and help, but we didn't have much of a choice. Sarah was right. Better safe than sorry. The three of us jogged after her, including Max, who was barking anxiously. The trail pitched steeply upward, and I tried to keep up the pace, tried to shut out the sound of the siren, but it was difficult. It was a horrible sound, an eardrum-grating high pitch that slowly tilted downwards. I forced myself to keep running, even though my legs burned and I struggled to breathe. And then we came upon another sign. This one was poking halfway out of the brush, nearly obscured by the foliage, but the bright orange color immediately caught my eye, even though all my focus was on running uphill. The sign read, "Warning, while the siren is on, don't look back." "What's that supposed to mean?" I shouted to Sarah. "I don't know, but keep moving." Because we heard it now. The dull rush of something in the distance. It sounded like it could be the roar of an enormous amount of water coming towards us. "We're more than 100 feet above the original sign though," I told myself. "We're safe. We passed that like a half hour ago, way more than 100 steps." The path continued upwards, a steeper and steeper incline. Sarah slowed to a walk ahead of me, gasping for air. I did the same. My legs felt like they were on fire. The trail ahead of us curved sharply, cutting through the dense underbrush. But as we rounded the bend, another sign came into view. "Warning. Beyond this point, you will be responsible for the cost of your own search and rescue." What the hell?" I whispered. The four of us stopped dead, staring at it. The forest beyond the sign looked darker somehow, the trees blotting out all the light. The trail continued up before making a sharp left. What was up there waiting for us? Wasn't the high ground supposed to be safe? But then Sarah grabbed my arm, and I saw that to our right, the trail branched off and led to a clearing. At its entrance was another sign. "If the siren sounds, take shelter in hut." It was bright orange like the rest, with crude pictograms of people entering a hut, but that's where the similarities ended. It was attached to a wooden post and not metal, and the text had faded to a dirty gray color. Beyond the sign stood a small cabin. We had come across several wilderness huts on our trips, tiny cabins built along some trails where people could sleep or seek shelter. This one looked like it was in particularly bad shape though. The roof appeared warped and nothing seemed to sit at a proper right angle. It also appeared to be water damaged, as there was a stagnant pond just to the left of it, coated in a film of algae seeping into the floor of it. Sarah jogged towards it. "Wait," I called, sprinting over. "Stay here, I'll clear it first." I rummaged in my pocket and pulled out my utility knife, and then I turned on the flashlight on my phone. Holding both defensively in front of me, I pushed the door open with my foot. Darkness awaited me. I stepped inside. The old wood creaked under my feet. I swept the flashlight across the interior, but it was clear that it was empty. Not many places to hide in a tiny wilderness hut. "It's clear," I shouted. The cabin in front of me was dark. It was small, maybe only about 100 or 2 square foot. illuminated by a small window on the left side. And unfortunately, it was not clean. There was various debris strewn all over the floor, including a water bottle and an old t-shirt. Not to mention the left side of the floor was permanently damp from the pond, pitted and disintegrating. Once everybody was inside, I swung the door shut behind us. The cabin fell into near darkness, except for my phone's flashlight and the weak light from the window. "Turn that off, it'll waste the battery," Sarah said. She rummaged in her backpack and after a minute pulled out a lantern. The sickly cool white LEDs lit the cabin, oddly modern against the old warped wood of the walls. The four of us sat down on the drier part of the floor. Matthew gave Max some water and his loud slurps echoed in the silence. The old wood creaked under my weight and the smell of the cabin engulfed me, damp and earthy like wet wood starting to rot. But all things considered, it wasn't a terrible place to stay for a little while. "What do we do now?" I asked. "I don't know, hide out until the siren stops," Divya replied. "Yeah, the trail might be flooded for hours," Matthew said. "I don't think the siren stopping means that it's safe to leave." Well, shit. This was turning into a trip from hell. "We could always use one of the beacons," I said. Sarah chewed her lip. "Isn't that a little extreme?" "No, we're stranded in a cabin in the middle of nowhere," I replied, my tone getting a little snappy. "But we have food for 4 days. We could just camp here instead," Sarah replied. I scoffed. "We don't even know if it's safe to go outside. How are we going to go to the bathroom?" Sarah pinched the bridge of her nose and sighed, like she was completely sick of my shit and had no energy left to deal with me. "Look, let's just chill out for a bit," she finally said. "Clear our heads. If things still seem bad in an hour, we'll send an SOS out on the walkie-talkies, or use a beacon or something." I wasn't happy with that, but I grumbled and okay. I walked over to one of the lone windows at the far side of the cabin. I could feel the damp wood squish underneath my boots. This cabin wouldn't be standing for much longer. Who the hell thought it was a good idea to build it next to a pond? I peered out, but all I could see was forest. Miles and miles of it extending to infinity, and the scummy green algae gently swirling on the pond surface. I sat back down next to Sarah and rummaged in my pack for a granola bar. Divya leaned against the wall, flipping through photos on her camera. Matthew pulled out a book on cryptocurrency and began reading. I pulled my hoodie closer around me, the chills seeping in through the damp walls. And then Divya spoke. "Hey guys, come check out this photo." She passed around her camera. It was a photo of the stream down below zoomed in, so that you could see the contours of the water rolling over the rocks. "It's a nice shot," I told her, giving her a smile. "Do you see it?" "See what?" She huffed like I was the dumbest person in the world and grabbed the camera back, and then she zoomed in on a part of the stream and handed it back. "The way the reflection's there on the water," she said. "It looks like a face." Huh? Now that she said something, I could sort of see it. The way the water coasted over the rocks, the reflections of the sky above, it almost looked like a woman's face, her mouth wide open in an O, in a silent scream. A shudder went through my body and it was kind of creepy. "Let me see," Matthew said, grabbing the camera. "Oh, yeah, that is creepy." "That's just pareidolia," Sarah snorted, when the camera finally made its way to her. "Like how you see things in the clouds and stuff." "Or it's a ghost," Matthew said, laughing. "Okay, come on," I said, crossing my arms. "Can we not tell ghost stories while we're trapped in a cabin 8 miles from civilization while a weird siren's going off?" "Okay," Divya replied, rolling her eyes. "I just thought that it was weird." We settled into silence for another 10 minutes, eating and reading and flipping through photos. And then Max began to growl, a deep rumble in his throat. He stood up and stared at the door, hackles raised. The four of us exchanged nervous glances. "Hey, sweet boy," Divya said. "Is something out there?" He continued to growl, his eyes never leaving the door. And then we heard it, a light scratching sound on the door. Probably just a squirrel or something, I told myself. The scratching continued, not fast and frantic like you would expect a squirrel's to be, but slow and deliberate, over and over again. And then I realized something else. The door wasn't locked. The door didn't have a lock. I got up and I tiptoed across the floor, and then I pressed my back against the door, pushing all my weight into it. My heart pounded in my chest. I immediately pictured a scene out of The Shining, a Jack Torrance with an axe on the other side, raising it up and hacking away at the wood, the steel blade slicing open my back. I took a shivering breath in and then out. Max continued to growl. The siren continued to wail in the distance. I closed my eyes, trying to shut it all out, trying to focus on only one thing, keeping the door shut, putting as much of my weight against the wood as I could. I was jerked out of my thoughts by a loud gasp. I opened my eyes to see Sarah staring at the window. I followed her gaze and my heart fell through the floor. Someone was looking in. A man with his hands cupped against the glass, peering in at us. As soon as he noticed us looking, he disappeared from the window. "What the hell?" "I didn't mean to scare you," called a man's voice from outside. "It's Brian, the park ranger here. You guys all okay in there?" His voice slowly made its way around the side of the cabin, stopping at the front door. The four of us glanced at each other wide-eyed. Max let out a low growl. What are the chances that a park ranger would be patrolling up here right now so far out? I heard the siren go off, so I wanted to check if everybody was safe. He continued as if reading my mind. "You all okay in there?" "He's not a real park ranger," Divya whispered. "But he was wearing the outfit," Sarah whispered back. "I saw it." "Yeah, we're fine," I called through the door, trying to make my voice sound deep and booming. "When are we allowed to leave, though?" "Oh, when the siren turns off, that's the all clear," he replied. "Usually a few hours. You all good until then?" I mean, he sounded legit, but I wasn't about to let some random stranger who could be armed into the cabin. It'd be like shooting fish in a barrel. "Yeah, we're good," I shouted. "Alrighty then," the man said. A few anxiety-filled minutes passed. Max stopped growling but kept his eyes on the door. "Do you think he's gone?" Sarah whispered. "I don't know," I whispered back. I hadn't heard footsteps, but I wasn't convinced that I would with the volume of the siren. Divya got up and peered out the window and then shook her head. "I can't see the front," she whispered. I kept my back pressed against the door, sighing. We spent the next hour just waiting. Matthew and Divya got out some food. Sarah pulled out her Kindle and started reading. I sat with my back against the door, sullen. The three of them seemed to be taking this a lot less seriously than I was. I mean, we were in legitimate danger, but everybody was acting like things were swell. But then I noticed something. On the other side of the cabin, barely illuminated by the lantern, a book, heavy and leather-bound. "Can you watch the door?" I asked Matthew. Reluctantly, he got up and took my spot, taking huge bites out of a sandwich. The leather was stained and warped. The words "Visitor's Log" were embossed on the cover. I flipped it open and started paging through the entries. They started all the way back in 2012, and it didn't seem like any of them mentioned the siren, at least so far. Sarah sidled up to me. "Oh, is that the logbook?" "Yeah," I replied. "Wilderness huts often had logbooks. You were supposed to sign in, write a little about yourself, the stay or the weather. I don't see anything about the siren though." "Huh." I flipped through for a while, getting closer and closer to the end of the journal, and then suddenly I stopped. The word siren glared up at me from an entry dated last fall. I began to read. "Hello, fellow campers. This is Jared writing to you on October 7th, 2023. I'm out here with my girlfriend and some buddies from high school, Eddie and CB. We're stuck here in the cabin because the warning siren went off. It's been on for 20 minutes now, and we would all probably be deaf by now, except Jess brought earplugs. She's a keeper." A few lines later, Jared's entry continued, the handwriting a bit more sloppy. "It's 7 p.m. and the siren is still going off. We're going to spend the night here and leave in the morning. I have no idea how any of us are going to actually sleep with that thing going off, but it's better than getting caught in a flood. Oh well." They were here the whole night, I thought, dread sinking in my chest. The siren was on a lot longer than just a few hours. I turned the page and made a crinkly, crackly sound under my fingertips. "We're having an okay time though. We decided to make a fake campfire with our flashlights stacked in the middle of the room, and we had some uncooked s'mores, and we're all telling ghost stories. CB had a really good one about a guy getting his face eaten off by Bigfoot. But Jess's was the best though, because she broke the fourth wall and made it about us. She said that it's not flooding water out there, but ghosts. Yes, it's a horde of ghosts that can't go past a certain altitude, because the thinner air prevents them from materializing. It sounds stupid on paper now, but we're all pretty creeped out, to be honest." The entry went on and on for a while like that, detailing the other people's stories, and then Jared went off on a random autobiographical tangent. Apparently he was an IT specialist by day but a rock guitarist by night, much to the chagrin of his neighbors. He had just booked a gig at some local nightclub and thought that it was his big break. I turned the page. To my surprise, the log entry ended abruptly. There were just a few lines of text on the page. They were almost unreadable from the sloppy, frantic handwriting. I leaned in close to read, and I froze. "The cabin is a trap. I repeat, the cabin is a trap. Get out of the cabin." The logbook fell out of my hands. Sarah stared at me. What did he mean by that? I stood up, legs shaking underneath me. "We have to get out of here." "What?" Divya asked, confused. I handed her the logbook. Her eyes widened as she read the entry. Matthew looked up at me. "But how do we know that he's right?" he asked. "It could be a prank or a trap. It seems safe here. I think we should leave." I started for the door, but then I froze. The distinctive sound of trickling water behind me. I turned around. The floor in the far left of the cabin wasn't just damp now. It was shiny and slick. Water was pooling inside, and it was moving. I scrambled away, frantically pointed at the undulating surface. There was something terribly, terribly wrong. As soon as the water made contact with Sarah, her eyes rolled back in her head, and then her mouth opened slowly, wider and wider. A horrible gurgling sound came out. Her entire body lurched like she was trying to cough but couldn't. Water dribbled down her chin. She was drowning. I grabbed her by the waist and lifted her up, pulled her away from the quickly spreading pool. As soon as she was no longer in contact with the water, her eyes returned to normal and she began hacking away, water splashing down her arms. But where she had just been sitting, the water shimmered upwards, defying gravity, and then it began to form a figure, tall and thin, towering over me. "Run!" I shouted. I leapt for my bag and burst out of the cabin, but when I got out, there was something blocking my way. Something was climbing its way out of the pond on all fours. A person, a woman, coming out of the water. Pale translucent skin covered in sickly green algae, hair that dragged along the ground obscuring her face. I pivoted around her and we ran. A gurgling, sputtering noise came from behind us, and then a voice. "Run!" But it was my voice, coming from the creature's throat. It didn't sound quite right, like her lips didn't quite know how to form the words, like her throat was full of water. As we got to the trail, I pulled the beacon out and I held it up, hoping that the sky wasn't completely obscured by trees. We ran downhill towards the parking lot until I spotted the stream in the distance down below. It was flooded. The stream had tripled its width now, but as I looked, it wasn't just water, but writhing bodies made out of water. Some turned into flesh and crawled out of the stream in jerky, spider-like movements, wet hair plastered over their faces. It all made sense now. These things, they were tethered to the water. And even though the cabin was on high ground, it was right next to that pond. We backed up the trail. The siren droned in our ears. Those things continued to crawl out of the stream. I racked my brain trying to figure out where we could go, where we would be safe, far from water. "The fire tower," I murmured. We made our way off the trail, away from the stream, through the thick underbrush. Eventually we made it there. The tower rose up above us like an old beast, the send help sign staring down at us through the grimy window. We were sweating, aching, scratched up with thorns, but we would be safe. Sarah ran over to the metal ladder and climbed up. The ladder shook under her weight, but it held steady. When she made it to the balcony, I started up. And then it happened. When I stepped up, the metal rung made a loud screeching sound, and Max suddenly spooked and took off running. "No!" Divya shouted, and then she broke into a run after him. "Divya!" Matthew yelled. After a second of hesitation, he started after them. "Go up, we'll be right back." I watched him take off after her, chewing my lip. "Come on," Sarah shouted from above. She helped me up onto the balcony. I looked out at the forest, scanning for Max and Divya, or any water spirits, but I saw nothing. The sun dipped near the horizon, molten gold, sending long spidery shadows through the woods. The blue-gray pallor had taken over the shadowy side of the mountain. We were running out of daylight. "Do you see them?" I asked Sarah. "No." After 5 minutes, I pulled out the walkie-talkie. "Matthew." "Almost got him," he said, his voice crackling with static. "They're right up ahead." We waited and waited. Matthew didn't come back. Finally, an hour later, his lanky form entered the clearing, alone. He looked up at us and simply shook his head. Divya wasn't responsive on the walkie-talkie. No one seemed to be responding to our beacon. We were here, all alone in this dilapidated fire tower, staring out at the forest at the quickly dwindling sunlight. A stiff breeze whistled in through the shattered window. Matthew laid down on the bed in the corner, staring up at the ceiling, completely silent. We tried to comfort him, we tried to help, but he was so grieved that he could barely speak. Sarah and I lay down on the floor, and eventually, despite everything, fatigue overtook us. We fell asleep. But at 3 a.m., I awoke with a start. It took me a second to place where I was at. Engulfing darkness, the cold wood underneath my back. As soon as I realized, I reflexively reached for Sarah, but she was fine, sleeping peacefully next to me. And then I realized what woke me up. The walkie-talkie was on. Crackling static came through the speakers, and then a garbled voice.
Can you hear me?
It was Divya. I scrambled up and grabbed it. I can hear you, where are you? More static, and then her voice again, garbled and unintelligible.
Can you hear me?
She repeated. Where are you? I shouted. Sarah stirred next to me. She pulled herself up, blinking at me. What's going on? She muttered. It's Divya. Now Matthew was scrambling out of bed. He reached over me and grabbed the walkie-talkie. Divya, I can hear you. Can you hear me? His voice wavered with emotion. The static rattled back at us. I could hear a few blips of her voice, but that was it. There'll be better reception outside, I said. Come on. The siren was off. It must have turned off sometime while we were sleeping. Matthew opened the door and walked out onto the balcony, holding the walkie-talkie high over his head. Where are you? He shouted into it. I could see tears streaming down his face, shining in the moonlight. Divya's voice came back a little bit clearer.
I don't know. I've been wandering around.
More static cut in, but then she continued.
I passed the sign, the one that said run uphill 100 feet. I tried to follow the trail, but it's so dark out.
Okay, listen to me very carefully, Matthew said. Do you have your beacon?
Yeah.
And yours has these strobe lights, right?
I think so.
Turn it on so that we can find you. The three of us stood out on the balcony. A stiff wind blew, chilling me to the bone. Poor Divya, she must be freezing out there. Sarah grabbed my hand and squeezed it hard. We stared out over the forest, shrouded in darkness, only the treetops bathed in silver moonlight. And then we saw it. To our far left, a strobe light flashing among the trees. Let's go, I whispered. We crawled down the ladder slowly, trying to not make the metal creak with our weight, and then we started out for the light. Matthew led us and I followed, holding up the one weapon that we had brought, pepper spray. Sarah was last, trailing behind us. We meandered down the trail in the dark, flashlight sweeping across the uneven path. The strobe light continued flashing up ahead of us. We see the beacon, Matthew said into the walkie, his voice cracking with happy sobs. We're heading right towards you. We'll be there in a second, okay? Divya's voice came back, garbled with static. I couldn't make out a single word. It didn't matter to Matthew now, though. We would be there in a minute. We continued down the path, almost jogging now through the darkness. The beacon shimmered through the trees, getting closer and closer. The walkie signal suddenly cut in full force. Divya's voice came through loud and clear, shouting 3 words.
That's not me.
We froze in our tracks. What? Matthew whispered.
I didn't turn on the beacon yet.
Divya replied. We stared at each other in the darkness. The silence of the forest weighed in on us. Not a single leaf rustled. We all stared at the beacon flashing on and off, shining brightly through the trees. And then we heard it. A voice shouting ahead of us. Matthew, is that you? But the voice was choking and garbled, like it was coming up from the water. Help me. Divya's voice came over the radio again, staticky.
That's not me.
The strobe light ahead began flashing strangely now, in a regular rhythm flashing through the trees. With every flash, I realized that there was something ahead. Shadows, silhouettes, of several women standing in the darkness, motionless. They were luring us to them, like an anglerfish lures in its prey. Help, Matthew, please. The choking, sputtering voice shouted, and then another strobe light came on, like a twinkling star to our far right.
It's on.
Divya shouted through the walkie. As we ran, the voice began screaming, a horrible, gut-wrenching scream, raw and hoarse as if Divya was being ripped apart, bubbling up from the water. Matthew stopped for a moment. I grabbed his arm and I pulled him ahead. "It's not real," I shouted in his ear. "Come on." We stepped off the trail and down an incline, rocks rolling underfoot. Our flashlights swept over the uneven ground, casting long shadows of the trees that flickered and shifted, as if they were alive. The strobe light pulsed ahead of us, even and rhythmic. The not Divya was still screaming behind us, but the nature of the sound had changed. The screams sounded almost animalistic, like coyote howls. They echoed off the sides of the mountains, making it sound ethereal, strange. Each one sent a cold shudder down my spine. Within 5 minutes, we had reached Divya. She was sitting on the ground next to Max, the beacon set in front of her. As soon as she saw us, she ran over and wrapped her arms around Matthew, sobbing. "I thought that you would never find me," she cried into his shoulder. "Come on, let's get back to the tower," he replied, holding her close. We waited all night, huddled on the fire tower. As soon as dawn broke, a pickup truck rattled into the clearing. 2 park rangers stepped out and climbed up the fire tower, assuring us that it was safe to leave. But neither one of us would answer any of their questions. "Hey, the flooding's over," is all they kept saying. "It's safe now." But when they dropped us off in the parking lot, the younger one, a woman, lingered. Once her partner had disappeared back into the ranger hut, she lowered her voice and said, "They are Rusalka." "What?" I asked. "The water spirits. That's what they're called, at least in Poland and thereabouts. Americans don't have a good name for them." What are they?" And then she told us everything. Apparently in the 80s, a local woman got pregnant. Her boyfriend, angry because she had planned to keep the baby, drowned her in the stream here. That was the death that I had read about when researching the park. The local woman. I didn't realize that it had been a homicide. "That's what Rusalka are," the park ranger explained. "Women who are drowned at the hands of their partners." She told us that there was something else though. Something that wasn't well documented in the folklore. Apparently, Rusalka are like pack animals. When one is created, she draws others like a magnet. As long as there's a water source, Rusalka and surrounding areas will come to her. And this woman's death somehow started a chain reaction where it drew one Rusalka to this park, and then several, and then many, like water flowing downhill into a lake. Every so often, they show up and become aggressive, and that's when they sound the siren, according to the park ranger. But there are apparently some men who are obsessed with the Rusalka and try to help them. This time, they had switched the signs on the trail. The sign warning about a search and rescue operation was supposed to be in front of the cabin. The sign telling us to seek shelter in the hut was supposed to be further up the trail, where there was a new and perfectly safe wilderness hut. And Brian. There is no park ranger named Brian. This woman suspected that he was one of the men that liked to help the Rusalka, and he wasn't trying to help us. He was trying to offer us up as a sacrifice to them. After telling us everything, she gave us a stern look. "You didn't hear any of this from me, got it?" We nodded, stunned. And then she started back towards the ranger hut. "So, take this as your warning. If you're ever backcountry camping, stay away from Mount Kiernan and Pine Lake Park. In fact, try to avoid bodies of water at all, because you never know what's in them, lying in wait, ready to pull you under."
Damon McCory, Wayne, Big Country Allen.